Hey everybody, I'm not quite back from my modern slop break, as I put it in the Doom the Dark Ages video, but I did want to go ahead and get a review done, so why not take a look at something that isn't modern slop? And more importantly, something that I don't really see a whole lot of coverage of, which in turn makes it interesting. This is Amulets and Armor, originally released for DOS, although you can get a Windows version these days. What you'll be seeing throughout this video is the DOS version of Amulets and Armor Classic version 1.04, which is the latest freeware release. And that is actually important to mention because Amulets and Armor was originally released back in 1997 as a DOS game, and apparently it sold less than 100 copies, which isn't really surprising. It got no advertising to speak of, and the tech on display here was woefully outdated by 1997. We're talking basically Doom Engine levels of tech. In the same year, we got the likes of Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, Hexen 2, and Quake 2. Even other 2.5D games that were popular at the time, like Shadow Warrior, were still considered severely outdated by that point, and they really were only able to succeed because, well, it's Shadow Warrior, it had the 3D Realms thing going for it. This game, on the other hand, it was a small indie team that released the game without a publisher and without any kind of advertising, so it just faded into obscurity very quickly, again, selling less than 100 copies back in the day. But weirdly enough, where a lot of games would just fade into history and be forgotten, Amulets and Armor had a bit of a different fate, because back in 2012, a multiplayer Let's Play of the game was put together by Ms. Bundefund and Bacter on the Something Awful forums, for those of you who might actually remember those from way back in the day. And this Let's Play ended up being fairly popular and brought some attention to the game. And during this kind of resurgence in attention that Amulets and Armor was getting, one of the game's former developers managed to get permission from the rights holder to Amulets and Armor to not only re-release the game as freeware, but to continue development on a sort of community edition of the game that would feature, of course, bug fixes and performance improvements and such like that, but also would allow the game to run on modern operating systems, particularly Windows, but it could also theoretically be ported to Mac and Linux as well. And there was also going to be an editing tool release that would allow players to create their own maps and quests for the game, and there was also a port to the OpenGL renderer in the works, although it seems like development on that has more or less stalled out. The last update on the dev blog is from 2015, and there doesn't really seem to be any significant changes to the source code since then. That said, Lyle, the developer in question here, did update some of the README files and such fairly recently as I'm recording this, back in June of 2025. So who knows, maybe we'll see a version 1.05 eventually. But as I'm recording this video, the most recent version of the game is from a dozen years ago and is version 1.04, again, what you're seeing in this video. So just keep in mind as we're going throughout the rest of this review that the version you're seeing in this has been updated and improved since the original release of the game back in 1997. And now that I've gotten the interesting story of this game's release history out of the way, what exactly is it? Well, it's described by the developer as a first-person crawler, which isn't really elaborated on much by the developer, but the idea, I think, behind calling it a first-person crawler is to put it in the same general category as games like, say, Eye of the Beholder, or especially something like Dungeon Hack, where you're a single character, just kind of classic dungeon crawler style games. The thing is that Amulets and Armor doesn't really fit that category. This is really more of a first-person action hack-and-slash kind of game that has some very, very light RPG mechanics associated with it, which I'll obviously explain more when I get to the gameplay. But suffice to say, Amulets and Armor is in a fairly odd space as far as genre classification goes. It doesn't delve deep enough into the RPG mechanics to put it into the same company as proper dungeon crawlers, like of course Eye of the Beholder, Menzo Baron Zen, or a Dungeon Hack, or any number of things like that, but it's also not leaning quite enough into action gameplay to put it in the same category as the likes of Heretic, or especially something like Hexen or Witch Haven. It's a pretty odd game that falls somewhere in between those approaches, And that's why I was really interested to take a look at this thing. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and start delving into the game itself and see what exactly we're dealing with here. Now, like always, we'll go ahead and start with presentation. This game runs on a proprietary engine that was designed by the developers, and it's more or less at a Doom engine level of tech. Now, this obviously means that the game was severely outdated in technology by the time it released, because the original Doom came out in 1993, so that was 4 years prior to this game, and by the time Amulets and Armor released, we had the likes of Quake 2 and Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2 and so on and so forth. Full 3D was seen as what should be the norm and what was going to be the future, and if you were running any kind of 2D game, even if it was something that really works well in 2D, like a 2D platformer, that was actually seen as a bad thing at the time. Is that an idiotic way of looking at things? Absolutely, but that's how a lot of people thought back in the 90s, when stuff like the N64 and PS1 came out and you start to see 3D games being released on them. They acted like stuff on the Genesis and SNES and other 2D consoles were somehow dramatically inferior, even if the games themselves were actually considerably better than the stuff that was releasing in 3D. Ironically enough, now that we're living in an era of severely diminishing returns on visuals, people aren't really paying as much attention to visuals anymore and are back to things that actually matter, so I guess everything comes full circle eventually. But as for Amulets and Armor, it's not just that the tech was outdated at the time it released, it's that it just doesn't look very good. It'd be one thing if this game looked like, say, Heretic and Hexen, with very nice, clean sprite work that is actually surprisingly detailed and has a lot of charm to it, but Amulets and Armor just flat out looks ugly. The texture work on the environments themselves is not very good, in no small part due to how uneven a lot of them are. You'll just be wandering around an environment and you'll see severely mismatched textures where a wall will continue, but the textures just abruptly change in the middle, so there's a clear line between them, which of course just looks bad, and the lighting effects the game does have are rather unevenly applied. You might go into an environment that has a lot of what appear to be light sources, but it's very dark, and then you might go into a different environment that has no apparent light sources and yet is brightly lit. They at least did a decent job of making the different environments appear somewhat like you would expect fantasy environments to look. So for example, if you go into a house, it looks kind of like a house, but it very much has that early Doom clone style of environmental design where you might have a couple of sprites that show things like a table and chairs or something like that. So you know what this space is supposed to be, but most of the room is just unoccupied, empty space, and it really looks pretty much the same as a bunch of the other rooms that you've been through. Or you might run into rooms that are just a bunch of empty space with no apparent purpose. And there are also a lot of areas in this game that just seem to be there to drag out the size of the levels rather than actually serve any functional purpose in terms of in-game lore or actual level design. And once you get past the way the levels look and how they're designed, the unit sprites are just rather undetailed to the point where a lot of times you can barely even tell what it is you're fighting. And it also suffers from a palette swapping problem where you'll be going up against certain enemies that are just recolored versions of each other, and while they technically have slightly different capabilities, functionally they're pretty much the same, so they're just boring to go up against. On top of all of this, the animations for both characters and your interactions on screen, so swinging swords or axes or whatever, are all just very simplistic. They don't look any different depending on which particular weapon you're using. So yeah, they'll look different if you're using a sword versus, say, an axe or a mace, but you don't get any differentiation with what weapon you're actually using. So an iron sword, a bronze sword, a hardened steel sword, and so on and so forth will all look the same when you're swinging them at enemies, and they don't have any special effects if they're a magical weapon. So, for example, if you have a lightning sword and you bonk an enemy with it, yeah, it would actually do lightning damage to the target, but you don't see the sword glowing with magical energy or crackling with lightning or anything like that. It just looks like every other sword you're using. So realistically, even if you get what should be a cool weapon, it just doesn't look cool when you're actually using it, and that's obviously going to be pretty disappointing. There's also not really much of a satisfying effect on target. When you hit an enemy, there is a brief blood puff, and they'll make a noise, and obviously they'll take some damage, but they don't really react to it much other than just getting a bit of hit stun effect. And when they finally go down, they just fall on the ground, and that's it. They don't spray blood everywhere, they don't get dismembered or anything like that. They just fall over, or if they're certain magical enemies, then they will just disappear effectively. They'll just crumple into nothing. And if you were fighting an enemy in some sort of pool of liquid, then they'll just fall beneath the pool and you won't even notice they're there. So visually, there's just nothing viscerally satisfying about the combat. But if it were just that the game didn't look very good, then that could be forgivable. Unfortunately, the visual problems spill over into gameplay issues as well. Particularly things like a lot of doors that you need to go through in this game being secret doors that are basically indistinguishable from regular walls, so until you get access to the mapping spell, you'll just find yourself stymied by these very samey looking environments, and eventually just resort to hugging the walls and just constantly mashing the activate key until eventually you find the secret door that you need to go through. In addition, trying to pick up items in the environment can be a real pain, because the sprite work is a bit different than the actual interact boxes for the various items. So you might be trying to click on something to pick it up, and it's just not registering you as picking it up, or you might try to use the crosshair instead of the cursor to try to pick something up, and it's just not registering what you're looking at as the object you're trying to pick up until you look at it from a bit of a different angle. It's just janky in general that way. And on top of all of this, I am sure you have noticed throughout all of the gameplay footage that the user interface is just clunky. There's not really any other way of putting it. You do have some things that are laid out actually pretty decently, like whatever runes you have are shown in the bottom right, so you can just quickly move the cursor over to them, click on whatever you want to cast, and then click on cast, and it will cast whatever spell you've selected. But that's pretty much where the intuitiveness of the interface ends, because everything else is either hidden behind an awkward to navigate menu, like with the journal, where you have to just scroll through every single individual entry until you find whatever you're looking for, whether that be a spell you were reminding yourself of the runes for, or some sort of note that you picked up in the environment so you can maybe get a hint about some sort of puzzle you're looking at, meaning that it's just tedious to navigate that. The inventory is a grid system, which generally works fine, but it gets a bit tricky to manage because you have 5 pages of inventory and you can end up with an awful lot of items by the end of the game, so finding the one that you actually want to use can be a real pain. And then when you look at the rest of the interface, there's just a lot of unnecessary, completely pointless design to it. For example, you will notice that towards the center of the interface you have a box that has whatever your actively equipped item is, and most of the footage is going to be whatever weapon I happen to be using. Underneath that is the use button. Now obviously this means that whatever item you have in this box is what is equipped, and pressing the use button will use whatever it is. So if it's a weapon, you'll swing it. To the left and to the right of that are 2 information panels. The one to the left of this is styled to look like potion vials, and you have red, orange, green, and blue. To the right of this, you have numerical values starting with H, M, F, W, and L. And these are all used for exactly the same thing. The red vial, for lack of a better way of describing it, corresponds to your health, which is the red H. And based on how much health you have, the vial will be full or it will be emptying or whatever. The orange one corresponds to mana, the green one corresponds to your food, and the blue one corresponds to your water. Again, all of these values are listed in numerical form, which is infinitely more useful than these bars. To the right of the equipment slot, so the vials serve absolutely no purpose whatsoever. And then the L underneath all of that just tells you how heavy all of the stuff you're carrying put together is, which is something you really don't need to know as you're wandering around, because just simply seeing the number of kilograms you're carrying is not useful. You need to know what kind of encumbrance value you have, because that will slow you down, but simply knowing the number of kilograms you're carrying is pretty much useless. To the right of all of this, you have the spellcasting interface, which is split between two boxes. The first one has the cast button on it, and whenever you select runes, you'll see them pop up in there in the order you click them, and then you can click on the cast button to cast the spell. Above that is an undulating sine wave, which corresponds to how much mana you have, meaning that it's a third way of trying to read your mana that's even more useless than the vial, which was already pointless. Then, of course, at the far left of the interface, you have a bunch of small buttons that say INV, EQP, STS, so on and so forth. These all correspond to inventory, equipment, so that's what you actually have equipped on you, so your armor, your rings, your amulet, and whatever weapon you have. Then STS is your stat screen, so your actual character statistics. OPT is for your options. COM is the communications interface, which is just basically the quick chat options, so you can just have your character say something like, "The midnight bell!" And it has absolutely no use whatsoever in gameplay if you're playing it single player. If you're playing it multiplayer, you can use it to chat with whoever you're playing with, but that's it. FIN corresponds to finances. It just tells you how much money you have. AMO is the ammo interface. It tells you what kind of ammunition you have, which you will not be seeing me use most of the time for reasons I'll explain a bit later. Then there's NTS, which corresponds to your notes, where you can just type notes and the game will have those saved for you, which is admittedly handy. And then finally there's JNL, which is your journal. Now whenever you click on one of these, it's going to open the interface primarily on the right side of your screen, so you still have some interface showing you what you're looking at in the actual game world, and you can still interact with the interface to the right of all this stuff using the mouse. The thing is that this is a somewhat clumsy, awkward, and just generally clunky interface that takes a lot of getting used to, and even when you do get used to it, it's never really all that intuitive. Prime example there being just trying to use items, where if you need to, say, quaff a healing potion, then you have to go into the inventory screen, find the healing potion you want, click it, move it over to the item box where it has the use button, put it in there. Whatever item you had equipped, like your weapon for example, will then just start floating because it's now selected, like you had just picked it up from your inventory, and then you can hit use to use the healing potion. Then you have to click back into the box in order to put whatever item you previously had back into your hand. If they wanted to make it more intuitive, they might have put in something like quick slots for potions or scrolls, but they didn't do that. Instead, you have to specifically go into your inventory and do everything one item by one item. It's very tedious and never gets any less awkward. But while the game does suffer pretty severely in terms of visuals, both from just not looking very good and from it actually affecting gameplay, the sound design is, well, it's not great, but it's at least fair to middling. The sound effects get the job done, but aren't anything particularly impressive. There's nothing really all that viscerally satisfying about them. Spells sound suitably magical, for lack of a better way of describing them, kind of pew-pewy sounds to them. And all the sound effects feel pretty appropriate in general for a more medieval fantasy game of some sort, although again, they're just nothing all that impressive. There's not really much to speak of in terms of voice acting other than the lines that you're given in the communications thing, like "The Midnight Bell!" And generally those aren't really all that interesting either. They're definitely cheesy, which does give the game some charm, but absolutely none of it's ever going to stick with you, and when you're actually running up against enemies in the game that can speak to some degree, most of what they're doing is just yelling and groaning in pain, so there's not really much to speak of there. The only notable exception there is the lightning skeletons, which do get fairly annoying, but you don't encounter them very often, so that does help. And then, of course, there's the soundtrack, which consists of the title track that plays when you start the game up, and 5 tracks that play when you're actually wandering around the levels. They are all MIDI loops, they are quite simplistic, appropriate enough for a medieval fantasy game, but not particularly good, and in fact, after a while, they get quite annoying, especially since they repeat so much. So when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something that's unfortunately just not good. It's not enough to completely tank the entire experience, but it does make a rather poor first impression, and that's definitely going to matter for people who are looking to try this game. They're going to take one look at those visuals and that clunky, cluttered interface and go, maybe not. Rather than, well, maybe I can push past that and see what this game's actually about, which is, of course, the story and the gameplay. And that's where things get a bit complicated, because this game doesn't really have a story as much as it has a bunch of quests that all have self-contained storylines, and the actual overarching frame story is simply that you are an adventurer who is going upon these various quests ultimately for fortune and glory. And that's it. There are no twists and turns, there's nothing complicated with regards to your individual character, you're just some adventurer who is going on various quests for fortune and fame. But what about the quests themselves? Do they have stories? Well, yes and no. They do have storylines. They have the setup that is given to you when you accept the quest that tells you where you're going, why you're going there, what you might be facing, and what you'll ultimately be expected to achieve there. Then as you're wandering around the various areas during the quests, you will find notes that will give you some extra bits of story or lore to go off of, and they might tell you how to proceed, they might give you some information about the enemies you might be fighting, things like that. And then once you turn in the quest at the end, you get through all of the levels of the quest and finish it up, you'll get a summary blurb that basically explains how you hand in whatever you were expected to bring back, and they congratulate you on a job well done and reward you for your efforts. And that's pretty much it, actually. There's no cutscenes or anything like that to fill in extra story. You're just an adventurer going on various individual quests that don't really have a whole lot to do with one another other than some loose ties between a couple of the quests. And none of those ties really matter all that much in the long run because each quest is self-contained and can be embarked on at any time. There's recommended levels for going on them, but other than that, you can just go and do whatever quests you want in whatever order you want. And not only that, but you can also repeat them as many times as you want. You finish a quest, and it becomes available for you to go on again, so you can just keep doing the same quests over and over and over again if you really want to. And the game doesn't even really have an ending either. You finish the final quest that's available to you, the highest level one, and it's like, congratulations, you've saved the lands, here's your reward, and then it just kicks you back to the same menu you were at previously, and you can go on whatever quests you want again. Now sure, going on a higher level quest when you're low level is an incredibly stupid idea, but you can do that if you really want to. But with you being able to go through these quests in any order you want, and with each of them being self-contained, it's pretty much impossible to actually care about any sort of world building or character or storyline or anything like that, because it's largely irrelevant to what you're actually experiencing while you're playing it. It's basically designed like an old school first-person shooter generally was in terms of story, where it's set up to give you some context for what you're doing, but ultimately everything just ends up falling to gameplay simply because there's not really much to speak of in terms of story. So how is the gameplay of Amulets and Armor? Well, it all starts in character creation, although I use the term character very loosely there. The only options you have for customizing what your character is going to be are selecting whatever class that character is and choosing whatever their name is going to be. There is absolutely no character customization other than that. You can't do things like pick the character's race or gender or appearance or anything like that. It's just class and name. So what are the classes and how does this all work? Well, the classes are Citizen, Knight, Mage, Warlock, Priest, Rogue, Archer, Sailor, Paladin, Mercenary, and Magician. And in terms of how each of these classes differ from one another, they all have different starting attributes, of which you have 6 to look at, which are Strength, Constitution, Accuracy, Stealth, Magic, and Speed. And in addition to all of these, each class also has different restrictions on what kinds of armor and weapons they can equip, as well as what magic system they use. There are 3 magic systems, which are Arcane, Mage, and Priest, and the main differences between all of these are the arrangements of runes needed to cast various spells. Most of them are going to have access to the same kinds of spells over the course of the game, it's just the manner in which they are cast is going to be different. And there's a pretty significant difference in the effectiveness of that magic from the beginning up until the end. Arcane spellcasters gain access to all of their spells much more quickly than the other 2, but nearly all of their spells are either simple buffs or utility spells. They don't really have much in the way of offensive or defensive magic, and what little of that they do have is pretty weak. Meanwhile, mages gain access to a wide variety of spells that include not only buffs and utility spells, but also a lot of powerful offensive and defensive magic. But of course, as you would expect from mages, they're physically quite weak and can't really stand up to melee combat. And then finally, there are only 2 classes in the game that can use priest magic, those of course being the priest and the paladin, and they're the only ones who get access to healing magic, which is of course very useful. They also have a selection of defensive and buffing spells, as well as a few offensive spells that aren't particularly good. They're much better served actually just getting in melee with enemies, because both the priest and the paladin especially are actually pretty tanky. Most of the equipment restrictions make a lot of sense. For example, mages can only wear up to leather armor, and they can only use staves and daggers, whereas of course a knight has extremely limited spellcasting abilities, but they can equip whatever armor and weapons they want. Then there are some that have some slightly odd restrictions, like the Paladin, where they can equip whatever armor they want and whatever melee weapon they want, but they're not allowed to equip any ranged weapons, of which the game only has one type of ranged weapon, and that's a crossbow. Not exactly something that's difficult to work around, but it is something to be aware of as you're looting things in the environment. But the most important thing to keep in mind with these various classes is that this game is not remotely balanced for all of the classes. And this is where I have to bring up that the game was not originally designed to be a single-player game. Originally, it was designed to be a sort of multi-user dungeon. These were the predecessors to MMOs, where you had a whole bunch of people playing in the same kind of dungeon crawler environment. Think of the original Neverwinter Nights, for example. And obviously, if you have a sort of multi-user dungeon setup, then you will have a party of adventurers, and so you'll be able to get, say, one person playing a sort of melee tank class, like a fighter or a paladin or something like that. Another person will be the spellcaster, like a mage. Another one will be the healer, a priest or something like that. And then you'll have somebody else being the rogue who will be able to disarm traps and the like. And at some point during development, the mentality shifted away from doing the mud design and over to doing a more traditional single-player game with multiplayer components. And not only does that explain why the quests are repeatable and why you don't really get a dedicated start and end of a storyline or anything like that, but it also explains why the class balancing is so atrocious if you're playing it in single player. If you're not playing one of the tankier classes like the Knight or the Paladin, then you're just going to have a rough time all around. Classes that can't equip heavier armors obviously are going to have less damage resistance, so they're not going to be able to tank the hits like these other classes can, and they're going to be more reliant on ranged combat to keep enemies away from them. Well, that's easier said than done, both because in the case of mages, they need to rely on their spells, meaning they need to constantly keep their mana reserves high enough to be able to sling those spells at a constant rate, which, if you're relying on passive mana regeneration, is a losing battle. It just takes too long to regenerate the mana, so you have to rely on scrolls of gaining mana, because there aren't mana regeneration potions, and those scrolls take up 4 slots in an inventory, they stack up to 5, and not only does that weight add up, because the magic slinging classes are generally going to be weaker in terms of strength, so they're not going to be able to carry as much, but having to constantly use them gets rather expensive. Now, of course, once you get a bit further into the game and you start encountering more enemies that can cast spells right back at you, they will actually drop mana regeneration scrolls, so you can kind of keep your supply up at that point. but only to a certain degree. It's still going to be a very rough time. As for the more lightly armored classes that don't have much in the way of magic, like the rogue or the archer, they're going to be reliant more on ranged weapons, more specifically the crossbow, since that's all that the game has, and that means they need a steady supply of bolts, which also gets expensive until you start gathering them from fallen enemies, and even then you're still going to have to worry about weight restrictions, because again, these guys are going to be fairly weak in terms of strength. Meanwhile, the melee-centric tanky classes don't need to worry about any of that. Just throw some heavy armor on, grab a sword or an axe or whatever, and go to town on enemies. Maybe if you're a paladin, then you can cast healing magic on yourself to keep yourself in the fight, but other than that, it's pretty simple and straightforward. You can tank a lot of damage, and you probably will be tanking a lot of damage because you'll just be getting constantly hit, but you certainly won't be needing to worry about any kind of upkeep, and if you're playing as the paladin, you get the extra bonus of being able to pick up all of the bolts that you're finding from fallen enemies and then just selling them at the store for some extra cash. Because after all, you can't use crossbows, so you might as well get some use out of all these bolts that enemies are dropping. And even if you do have a steady supply of mana scrolls or bolts, you also have to contend with the ranged combat in this game just being very janky at absolute best. Projectiles are remarkably slow and have some aim assist attached to them, so if you're shooting at an enemy, it will sort of try to lock onto them and launch the projectile where they're kind of moving, but chances are they're going to just immediately turn and move the opposite direction, so you've just wasted a bolt. And then when you're casting spells, not only can you run into a similar effect and thus wasting mana instead of bolts, but you also might just run into the spell fizzling entirely, because that's a thing that can happen. You can just try to cast a spell and nothing happens. Thus, melee is generally the best way to go in this game, even though it is a constant situation of trading damage with enemies. You'll run up to an enemy, you start swinging at them, and if you just stand still, they will hit you. And that'll happen even if you're trying to be mobile, if you're trying to dart in and out of combat to where you run up to an enemy, you swing your weapon and try to time it just right so it'll actually hit them, because there is a bit of a delay when you swing versus when you actually hit, as you would expect with the animation. And so, even if you're trying to time that right, enemies will still hit you, and you can barely even tell they're attacking you half the time because of the way the sprites are drawn and because of how simple the animations are. This is less of a problem with ranged attacks coming in, because spells are pretty obvious, so if there's something that you can dodge, chances are you can dodge them as long as you see them coming. And I specify that if you can dodge them, because there are some spells that you really can't dodge. The only thing you can try to do is steer the projectile into the wall, because it's actually a homing projectile, and the homing projectiles are really obnoxious in this game, so avoiding taking damage from them is usually a losing proposition. You usually just end up having to tank it. But as for arrows and crossbow bolts, well, you can see those projectiles, but you have to be careful what environments you're in when you're trying to dodge those, because sometimes they do blend into the environments, so you may not even necessarily notice them coming at you. And unfortunately, simply avoiding the attack entirely is really the only way you can actually avoid damage. There's no shield that you can hold up to block incoming strikes or anything like that, and there's no spell you can cast to make yourself invulnerable. There is an item that will render you immune to all harm, but it's a quest item, so you don't actually get to hang on to it. It's an item you find at the very end of the quest line that you're on, so you don't even really get any actual use out of it before you turn it into the quest giver and get your reward. So unfortunately, a lot of the combat really just devolves into battles of attrition, where you're just hoping that your damage output and the amount of health you have can hold out versus the enemies. Now thankfully, even though you do have to put up with the clunky item usage and inventory management if you're trying to use things like mana regeneration scrolls or just scrolls of any kind, or if you're trying to use a wand, or if you're trying to use a potion or something like that, the game does allow you to toggle between two different ways of controlling your character. Either you can do it with the menu system up and running, in which case you can click on the various runes or click on the use button for whatever you've got in your inventory, or use the mouse cursor to click on items in the environment to pick them up and manipulate them. Or you can switch over to the control method that is much more conducive to actual combat, where it plays more like a traditional first-person shooter or first-person action game. You move around with the keyboard, but you can look everywhere with the mouse, and left-click will use whatever is currently in your equipment slot, and right-click will cast whatever spell you have prepared. But of course, you don't get the ability to manipulate the runes or pick up items in the environment using a mouse cursor with this particular control method. Instead, you have to look at the item in the environment and then press the use key. Now, realistically, you'll probably end up doing what I did throughout most of the game, which is switching back and forth between these control methods as I felt it was necessary. So I would go into a combat encounter using the controls that are more conducive to combat, and then once all of the enemies are dispatched, I would go into the other control scheme and then manipulate the runes to be able to cast whatever spell I wanted, and pick whatever item in the inventory I wanted to use to recover health, and so on and so forth. But of course, whether you switch between these control schemes or not, the game's never really going to feel all that intuitive to play. It's always going to feel a bit clunky and awkward, and matters are not helped by the rather slow movement speed, which is made even slower if you're over-encumbered, as well as the especially awkward jumping controls, where it feels like, for some baffling reason, they enabled ice physics, but only on the jumping controls, because there's no environments where ice physics would even come into play. So you feel really slippery when you're jumping, whereas when you're just moving around normally, you feel quite grounded. It is a really bizarre feeling, and it makes all of the platforming that is in this game quite annoying. Now, thankfully, there really isn't all that much platforming that you do need to complete in this game, but there is some, and those sections are just irritating. This brings me to, I guess the best way to describe it is quest design, which ordinarily would have you thinking along the lines of how quests in role-playing games like Baldur's Gate or Elder Scrolls or whatever are designed. But that's not what I mean here. In this particular case, the quest design is really more just level design. Every single quest in this game plays the same. You are dropped into the area, you start wandering around and exploring, you fight enemies, and eventually you will find some quest item that you need to bring back to town, and when you do that, the quest ends, you get your reward for completing it, and then you are free to pick whatever quest you want to go on next, including if you want to just repeat the one you just did. The quests themselves are split into individual levels, much like you would see in pretty much any old-school first-person shooter, for example. And when you look at the quest description, it will tell you how many of these levels are going to be in each individual quest. In total, the game has 30 levels that are split between 7 quests, starting with Visions of Jugurtha, the easiest level 1 quest, and concluding with the most difficult quest, simply called Destruction. Whenever you get to the end of a level and you step into the ending portal, for lack of a better way of describing it, it will give you the choice of either continuing on into the next level or stopping back at town so that you can sell your loot, replenish your hit points, and that sort of thing before going back into the quest. Your character is persistent throughout all of these. As you fight enemies, you will gradually earn experience points and level up, which will then automatically increase your stats, including health, mana, strength, etc. In addition to this, any equipment you currently have on you, as well as whatever is in your inventory, will carry over between not only levels, but also quests. The only real exception to this is the quest item that you picked up in order to complete whatever quest you were just on, because that will be collected at the end of the quest. Once you return to town, it will take that item away from you, and everything else in your inventory will remain the same. You'll get whatever reward was promised you, whether it be things like coins or just experience points or whatever, and then you're dropped back at the town interface. In this interface, you can not only interact with the quest menu, but you can also go into the shop and purchase equipment, purchase scrolls, potions, wands, even runes to be able to cast spells, and the shop's inventory expands as you complete quests. So not only will you be finding better equipment as you're wandering around the levels themselves, but you'll also eventually be able to purchase better equipment from the store. You can also sell whatever items you have in your inventory to the shop for some extra cash that you can then either reinvest in equipment or potions or whatever, except that the shop will not necessarily accept everything. It will not purchase runes from you, so if you picked up a bunch of runes in the environment and you can't use them, unfortunately you can't sell those either. And you also can't sell food or drink items to the store, nor can you sell rings to the store, but you can sell rings to the bank. That's definitely a weird choice, but you can at least sell the rings that you pick up. You just have to do it in the bank interface. Speaking of the bank interface, you go into this menu in order to store whatever currency you happen to be carrying, which is split between copper, silver, gold, and platinum coins, and you can only purchase things from the shop or the bank's ring interface if you're currently carrying the amount of currency for it. You can't simply buy things using money that's currently stored in the bank. So you might find yourself asking why you would want to store money in the bank. Well, that has to do with the game's save and load system. You see, this game actually doesn't have a manual save system, at least not in the sense of being able to do it while you're out wandering around the levels. Instead, it auto-saves whenever you first enter a level, and if you happen to die during the level, then you can respawn at the beginning of the level and lose an amount of currency in doing so. This is why you would want to store it in the bank. It's so that money remains safe and doesn't get used up whenever you respawn. The only other way to save is by going back to town and specifically using the inn. If you go into the inn, you can either rest in a room for free, which will not replenish any of your statistics, but if you pay for a more expensive room, then that will actually replenish your health, mana, food, and water meters, at least partially for a couple of the rooms, and if you pay for the most expensive room, then it just heals all of those to max. And when I say the room is expensive, I really mean that. It costs platinum coins, and platinum is pretty hard to come by until fairly late into the game. So it takes you a while to really be able to afford using the inn for its restorative properties. Regardless though, whenever you sleep at the inn, whether it's the free room or one of the more expensive ones, it will save the game for you, so you'll save your character data, all the stuff that's in your inventory, and then when you jump back into that character, then you'll be able to pick up where you left off. There is one mild annoyance with this though, and that is that whenever you use the inn, it will kick you back to the character select screen. I'm not sure why they designed it that way. It's just a mild annoyance, so it's not really a big deal, but it is still an annoyance where you're having to go to the end to save your game. You save your game and it automatically kicks you back to what is effectively the main menu with being able to pick what character you want to play. Then you have to select the character again, select the load button, and that'll load you back into the town where you can continue on your quest or go on whatever other quests are available. So unfortunately, they've just put in a bit of extra unnecessary tedium there. But as you might expect, from not being able to save manually while you're wandering around the levels, this does create some problems. The first of them is that the death and respawn mechanic is just annoying and is very easily circumvented, especially on modern systems where you're most likely to be playing this with DOSBox, where you can just close out DOSBox, relaunch the game, and you've lost nothing, but you have to start back from where the save was. The second problem is that you can't really get to good stopping points when you're actually in the levels themselves. You basically have to force yourself to complete them, or get to the point where you really don't know what you're supposed to do and have to quit playing and jump back to the menu and basically lose all of your progress with that particular section of level. Obviously, that's pretty annoying, and in the bizarre event that you manage to glitch out your game and have to restart, then you basically have to restart that entire level again. Again, pretty obnoxious. Not necessarily a deal breaker in itself, but definitely quite irritating. Thing is, while that's irritating when looked at in a vacuum, when you look at it in the grander context of the game, it becomes downright infuriating. This is because of the way the game's levels are designed. Now, I know it's taken me a while to get to that after I mentioned that that's what I would be talking about, but I needed you to understand some context about what this general gameplay loop is like, so you can better understand the chief problem this game has. The level design in this game is a bit all over the place. Some of the levels are actually fine, like the ones that are present in the shareware version, which is basically just the first quest of the game, and to some degree that does stand to reason. Generally speaking, you want to have a good showing of levels in your shareware release, so that entices people to pick up the full version. Think about the likes of the original Doom, for example, where you got to play Episode 1 for free, and those are arguably the best levels in the entire game. That's not necessarily to say that the levels in Episodes 2 and 3 are bad, it's just to say that Episode 1 was stacked with arguably the best levels in the game, precisely so it would entice people to pick up the full version. Amulets and Armor has a bit of a similar thing going on, where the shareware version of the game has some of the better levels in the game, but when you start delving into the levels that were only available in the full version, you get way more of a mixed bag. The real problem here, though, is that even the better levels in Amulets amulets and armor are not good. The ones from the initial quest are mostly passable, but even they have a lot of the problems that later levels in the game really suffer from, like a lot of the areas being very samey and difficult to navigate because there's not really a whole lot to orient yourself on, especially before you gain access to the magic map spell, or the level outright requiring you to find secret doors to actually be able to progress, otherwise you're not going to be able to finish the level, and not really getting a good indication of how to unlock certain doors. Some of them require keys, some of them require switches, and sometimes you'll come up to a door that is locked that is opened with a switch, and it'll just say the door is locked. But that could also mean that it requires a key. But you might also come up to a door and try to interact with it, and it will tell you that this door does not open here, which tells you that you have to activate it with a switch. And even if you do interact with a door that makes it fairly clear that you need a key to open it, it doesn't tell you what key you actually need, and even if you do find a key somewhere in the environment, there's not really any way of telling which key corresponds to which door. None of the keys or doors are marked with anything that will correspond to each other, so it's basically just a crapshoot. You can pick up a key, go find a door that you remember was locked, try it at the door, and it just won't open because you don't have the right key. You try a different door and it'll open that one. Obviously, this gets confusing and frustrating, just trying to navigate the levels and figure out what keys go to what doors, what switches open what doors. But the issue is compounded by the persistent character data. So you can pick up a key in one level that you require to open a door in the following level or the level after that. And the game doesn't really give you any indication that this is actually going to be the case. Even more frustrating, it only happens with a few levels. So for the vast majority of the game, if you find a key somewhere in the level you're on, then it will open a door somewhere in that level. It's just these few levels that require you to pick up keys and hold on to them until you get to the point where you actually have to use them in a following level. And that's confusing and frustrating enough, but it's made even worse by the fact that you can miss a key or two. Because some of these levels require you to find secret doors and secret passageways in order to actually progress, to actually finish the level properly. This includes finding quest items that you need to complete the quest. And even worse than that, you can actually lock yourself out of being able to finish a level, either by not having the right potions or spells available, such as some levels that require you to have lava walking, so you can walk on lava without taking damage from it, or some levels requiring you to have the ability to fly in order to be able to complete them, or in some cases, simply getting stuck in an area and not being able to get out of it. All of which you're not going to know going into these levels for the first time, at least unless you have some sort of guide, which isn't available for this game due to how obscure it is. The only guide-like material you're going to be able to find for this thing, at least right now, are the wiki that's on the game's website, and that is woefully incomplete, and that one co-op Let's Play that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Now some of you might be saying, but DW, the manual should be able to help you? Guess what? It doesn't come with a manual. Honestly, I legitimately don't even know if this game has a manual. After all, there are so few physical copies of this game in existence that I just have never actually seen one, so I have absolutely no idea if one came with the game or not. And the digital version of the game, the freeware release, doesn't have a manual. The best it has is the in-game journal that gives you the quick rundown of what all the menus are, and that's about it. So, for practical purposes, there basically isn't a manual for this thing, and you end up just having to figure everything out on your own, or use the woefully incomplete wiki, or use something like that Let's Play that I mentioned. And of those, the Let's Play is probably the most helpful of the bunch, and in fact it even gives you some of the exploits that you can use. For example, the final boss of this game is very easily cheesed. I won't spoil it for you, but I will mention that it's a rather amusing oversight, let's put it that way. But no matter whether this information is readily available and really all that useful, the fact that you feel like you need to consult external information just for basic level progression is a serious problem. That indicates a fundamental failing on the part of the level and narrative designers. Now, obviously, there's not much narrative present in this game at all. It's just basically set up for what you're doing, so that fails right off the bat. bat, and that meant that the level designers really had to compensate for that and do some heavy lifting, and unfortunately, they did not. I mean, it eventually gets to the point where the level design just feels outright adversarial towards the player. Not like it's trying to be a proper challenge, that it's trying to test your wits and test your reflexes and such, but rather that they just really want you to suffer. And the biggest filter moment, for lack of a better way of describing it, with this adversarial level design is when the game starts throwing a lot of dark wizards at you. Now, ranged enemies are certainly annoying in this game regardless. They are considerably more annoying when they can just destroy your equipment, because that's something dark wizards can do. They cast spells at you. Sometimes it just does damage. Sometimes it destroys a random piece of your equipment. And it could be literally any piece of equipment that you're currently wearing or using. It could be any of your armor pieces. It could be any of your rings. It could be your amulet. It could even be whatever weapon you're currently using. Whatever the case, you get hit with that destruction spell and it's immensely frustrating. In the case of just destroying, say, a piece of armor or a more generic weapon, then it's less irritating because you can at least go back to the store and get that, assuming it's something that you can get at the store and isn't something that you just found while you're wandering around the levels and is considerably better than the stuff you can find in the store. But it is considerably more infuriating when it destroys one of your rings or your amulet, because those are considerably more difficult to replace. If you're really lucky, then they will just destroy one of the rings that you can quickly and easily replace when you go back to town and go into the bank. If you're unlucky, they'll destroy something that you have to find in one of the levels, and there's only gonna be one of them in any of the levels, meaning that you're going to have to go back to wherever it was that you originally got that item, go through all of the quests up to that point again, just so you can get a replacement for that incredibly useful item you lost. Of course, if you really don't want to do that, and, well, I can't blame you if you don't want to do that, then you can always quit out of the level. That will abort any progress that you've made, and then you start the entire level over again. But if you do that, then you better pray to RNGesus, because it's going to be one hell of a crapshoot. Hell, in case you're wondering, that's partly why this video took so long to make. I kept having to restart levels over and over again because the damn dark wizards kept destroying my gear. And even if you somehow can get past all of that, after the levels that introduce the dark wizards and start throwing them at you en masse, there's a fairly sizable difficulty spike. The enemies you start fighting from then on out just hit really hard, and they have some pretty sizable health pools, so you're going to be wailing on them a while, you're going to be trading a lot of damage, you're going to be needing to heal yourself an awful lot. And it just drags what was already fairly tedious combat down to an absolute slog. So this is one of those weird instances of a game that starts out actually pretty interesting in the sense of being this kind of forgotten, ambitious title, and the more you play it, the worse it gets. But despite all of that, despite all of these failings of game and level design, all of the issues this thing has, the frustration that continues to mount as you play further and further, it's ultimately still an incredibly interesting game. It's fascinating. It's just bizarre. There's really not much else that's quite like it. I mean, you think about other games in this general style, you think of Heretic, Hexen, and Witchhaven, and none of them are really quite like this. I mean, they're all pretty straightforward first-person action games. Witchhaven's probably the closest one to this because it has the leveling system, but even that still feels pretty firmly rooted in first-person shooter game design, whereas Amulets and Armor is pretty awkwardly stuck between the worlds of a first-person action game and a dungeon crawler, like, say, Eye of the Beholder or something like that, and that gives it this very odd charm. It's just obvious that the developers' ambitions exceeded what they were able to achieve, both in terms of their budget and the technology they were working with, not to mention the idea of it apparently being designed originally as a multi-user dungeon, and then them not really being able to get that to work the way they wanted it to, so they retooled it into the really odd hybrid game that it is now, and you can't help but just find it fascinating. Now, it is certainly a shame that once you get past that fascination, it's an immensely frustrating experience to actually play the game, and so I really can't recommend it to somebody simply looking for a fun game to play. I can say that I don't regret playing through this, like I do find myself regretting playing through a lot of modern games. Because I will take a janky, broken, overly ambitious mess of a game like Amulets and Armor over any of the obnoxiously safe, boring slop that the industry is releasing these days. Because as messy as this game is, it's actually got character, and that counts for an awful lot these days. Now that said, again, I would not recommend picking this game up if you're just looking for a fun old-school first-person action hack-and-slash dungeon crawler kind of experience. But if you're something of a gaming archaeologist and you'd never heard of this game before, or especially if you're a big fan of incredibly janky games, well, maybe give it a try. You may or may not enjoy it, but you'll probably find it interesting at the very least. And if nothing else, it is freeware, so you don't really stand to lose all that much by giving it a try. So maybe some sanity. And for those of you who do want to give it a try, link to it is in the video description box. Thank you all very much for watching. I'm sorry it took so long for this video to come out. I've been working on it for the past couple of weeks, and it's been generally driving me insane, although recent events and general busyness have certainly not helped matters in that regard. But anyway, thank you all again for watching. Thank you all for your patience as I've been trying to get caught up on everything. I'm hoping over the next couple of weeks I can get caught up on a few more things and maybe get some newer stuff done as well. So stay tuned for all that. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.